Nikka Coffey grain and Nikka Coffey Malt. Insert your own coffee-related pun here. Welcome to Kanpai Planet. I'm Mac, back in Aloha Whiskey Bar in Tokyo to take a look at Nikka Coffey grain and Nikka Coffey Malt. Nika do say that the word coffee causes some confusion, but the name for these whiskies comes from the coffee stills which are used to make them. Although they're sometimes known as continuous stills or column stills, the name Nika went with comes from their inventor, Irishman Nikka Coffey. Coffey had seen all manner of still designs in his long career as a tacksman and was inspired to improve on what he'd seen. In 1830, at the age of 50, he patented a series of pot stills connected together in two columns. The liquid cycles through the columns until the spirit is strong enough to be distilled. This means that new spirit can be continuously added to the system as opposed to the batch distillation of a pot still. This gives you more juice at a higher ABV, much faster and more efficiently. It became the method of choice for distillers of grain whiskey, gin, vodka and rum. However, not everyone was enamoured with the new technology, especially in coffee's native Ireland. Coffee stills are steam heated, and while the lack of direct firing reduces maintenance, steam heating reduces flavour. In fact, distillers soon discovered that the coffee still is so efficient it strips distillates of the volatiles that add flavour, leaving a relatively tasteless high-strength spirit. In short, pot stills were about atmosphere. Coffee stills were about making lots of booze. Coffey himself gave up distilling, closing his dock distillery in Dublin and opening Nikka Coffey and Sons, building his stills for others. In his latter years, despite his legacy, Coffey drifted into obscurity and he died in 1852. It's even possible that the daguerreotype I showed you earlier is not of him, but of his son. Coffey's story stands in direct contrast to that of Masataka Taketsuru, the founder of Nika, who is hailed as the godfather of Japanese whiskey. During Taketsuru's apprenticeship in Scotland, he learned how to distill grain whiskey in a coffee still firsthand at James Calder in Bowness in 1919. Masataka valued the characteristics of this type of still and installed two sets of coffee stills in 1963 and 1966 at the Nishinomiya distillery. These were eventually moved to Miyagi-kyo, and they've been there in continuous use since September 1999. Fast forward to this millennium, Nika launched the first single cask coffee bottlings in 2003. In 2007, we got 3,000 bottles of Coffey Malt 12-year for the Japanese and European market. In September 2012, the coffee brand went mainstream as Nika launched their coffee grain whiskey in Europe, followed by a Japan release in June 2013. Coffey Malt was launched in January 2014 in Europe and later that year in June in Japan. They released these partly to create a market for single grain whiskey and partly to broaden their audience, and they did. They soon became very popular in cocktails. Soon after their release came the Nika Age-mageddon, an almost entire annihilation of the company's age statement lineup. The fact that these survived gives us a clue as to their average young age. It's not been plain sailing for them though. In 2019, between March and November, Nika cut supply due to exceedingly high demand and a stock shortage. As well as these two whiskies, Nika makes use of its coffee still to make Nikka Coffey Gin and Nikka Coffey Vodka. If you miss all the single casks, your one currently remaining variant is the single coffee grain, woody and mellow, 55% ABV distillery exclusive. They are bottled at 45% ABV, the same as single malt Yoichi and single malt Miyagi-kyo, which I've reviewed on this channel. It's interesting, Suntory have their 43% ABV preference and Nika has their 45%. In Japan, the suggested retail price is 6,600 yen, which is about $60 US. Now, because they were originally a European release, European RRPs are actually in line with the price you can buy them for in Japan. Both of these are chill filtered and they use minimum amounts of caramel to adjust colour between batches. They've coloured them roughly the same. You'll be pleased to know that both of these meet the requirements set out by the Japan Spirits and Liqueur Makers Association to be called Japanese whiskey. Oh no, wait! The coffee grain does, but the coffee malt does not, because it contains distillates that have been imported from Ben Nevis, the Scotch distillery owned by Nika. They've both won several awards, but will they win the most important award of all, the Kanpai Planet Seal of Approval? Let's find out. Let's start with the coffee grain. Now the main ingredient in here is US imported maize along with a small amount of malted two-row barley. Coffee grain is aged in refilled, remade and recharred casks originally made from American oak. On the nose, of course, there's corn and grain and grass along with toffee and caramel and vanilla custard. There's some fruit, some papaya and a small amount of mango, but there's a bit of clove and a strong acetone and nail polish note. Kanpai? There's a pretty heavy mouthfeel, not the oil that you'd get in a peated whiskey, but not quite the butter that I was hoping for. That corn, vanilla and caramel are there, joined by a little bit of dark chocolate. It feels sharper than on the nose. That clove is joined by nutmeg and pepper, but not in a good way. Those sharper notes create the illusion of a higher ABV, but yeah, it's still 45%. Despite the mouthfeel, the finish is quite short, and I'm getting some oak and some green apple and... What's the verdict? Bourbon fans might like this simply because of the corn in the mash bill. There are pops of sweetness, earth, wood, fruit, but they're a bit all over the place and, frankly, unbalanced. There's something missing, like a DJ playing to a sparsely populated dance floor. I've got a small favour to ask. If you're enjoying the content on Kanpai Planet, please share it with all your drinks-loving friends. It would mean the world to me. Kanpai. On to Nikka Coffey Malt. In the 1970s, Nika started distilling malted barley through their coffee stills. That's what's in this. However, they still categorise it as a grain whisky because it's not distilled in a pot still. They're following Scotch regulations there. Like the coffee grain, Coffey Malt is also aged in refilled, remade and recharred casks originally made from American oak. On the nose. Should I keep a straight face so there's some intrigue when it comes to the head-to-head? Nah, screw it. This is great. This is really interesting and there's a lot going on here. I'm getting some woodiness, I'm getting some butterscotch, I'm getting some pastry, I'm getting some honey, I'm also getting some fruit in the form of banana and melon. There's also an acetone note, but it's much more masked by the other aromas. Kanpai. There's much more structure in the Coffey Malt and a much more solid mouthfeel. There is sweetness in the form of chocolate and figs and yes, that butterscotch. Ooh, dare I say it. Is there some coffee? There is a bourbon feel to this one too, but you know, a better bourbon. The finish is medium and in addition to what I tasted on the palate, I'm getting some cinnamon and some star anise. And that acetone note is much, much less pronounced than in the coffee grain. What's the verdict? It's a great whiskey. A little on the sweet side perhaps, but enough balance and complexity to keep things interesting. I think this is a solid after dinner dessert whiskey and you could pair it with some chocolate cake or some pastries or creme brulee. So, dare I say it, head to head? I'm only really doing that for the sound effect. I've got to give it squarely to the Coffey Malt. There's more going on there, and more importantly, what is going on there is much more balanced. Not quite a Japanese pada dance floor, but on the way. So, should you buy them? Well, at the Japanese RRP of 6,600 yen, that's 60 US dollars, I think the Coffey Malt is a must buy. In fact, during the dark ages, I've even stretched my budget a little more than that. At that price, it's a great addition to the collection. However, much beyond that, and well, there's a lot of great whiskey out there. I have a few too many bottles of coffee grain because I always end up picking them up as a pair. Note to self, you can buy them separately. Nika's coffee whiskies are a great experiment. Like Scotch, Japanese whiskey distillers play up tradition, and that normally means pot stills. So it's great to see the coffee still doing more than just producing neutral spirit. And best of all, you can get these whiskies at a decent price. Until next time, Kanpai!